There are so many ways to factor, and there's not just one method that's going to allow you to magically factor whatever you want. So how do you choose which factoring method and strategy to use? Well, it's going to depend on the expression that you need to factor. But no matter what kind of expression that you have in front of you, you want to ask yourself, is there a common factor? Is there something you can divide each term in that expression by? Is there a greatest common factor that you can factor out of that expression? And if there is, then factor out your greatest common factor. And once you've factored out that greatest common factor, or there's no common factor in your expression, then you want to identify how many terms you have. And remember, terms are separated by plus or minus signs. So if you have two terms, you want to check if it's a difference of squares. So this is a special case here. Do you have a perfect square minus a perfect square? And remember, a perfect square is just something multiplied by itself. So if you have a perfect square minus a perfect square, not a perfect square plus a perfect square, it has to be a perfect square minus a perfect square, hence the name difference of squares. So if you have a difference of squares, you can use the difference of squares method to factor it. But if you have two terms, a binomial, and it's not a difference of squares, then it's likely that it can't be factored. Now if you have three terms, you want to look at the expression that you have and what does it look like? Well, if it looks like this, x squared plus bx plus c, so it's a trinomial, and its coefficient in front of your x squared term is 1, and you have b and c are numbers, but c is not equal to 0, then you would use the sum and product method. And that's when you're finding two numbers that multiply to give you c, but when you add those two numbers, it'll give you b. And if you have a trinomial, but you do have a coefficient in front of the x squared that's not equal to 1, then your trinomial probably looks like this: ax squared plus bx plus c. And in this case, you're finding two numbers that multiply to give you a times c, and when you add those two numbers together, you get b. So when your coefficient in front of your x squared term is not 1, you're going to use the decomposition method to factor it. But if your trinomial looks like this, it's a perfect square trinomial. So in a perfect square trinomial, the first term and the last term are all perfect squares, but the middle term is the one that's going to tell you if it's going to be a perfect square trinomial. So the middle term in a perfect square trinomial is always going to be 2 multiplied by the square root of your first term and multiplied by the square root of your second term. So if a squared is my first term and b squared is my last term, the middle term is going to be 2 times a times b. Or it could be minus 2 times a times b. And when you factor it, you would just follow these formulas. But if you don't know how to do this, you could always just take this trinomial and use either your sum and product method or your decomposition method as usual. But if you have 4 terms or more, you want to try a factor by grouping strategy. And this is going to be when you group some of the terms together strategically so you can find a common factor between or within those groups. So for instance, if we group these first two terms, we can factor out a c. And then if we group these last two terms, we can factor out a d. And with factor by grouping, there will be more trial and error because sometimes you might have to rearrange your expression to get something that you can factor out. And those are some of the strategies you should use when you're factoring. If you don't know how to use a particular factoring method, then you can check out any one of these videos.